Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of TWL, Together We Learn. So Together We Learn started off as an internal learning exercise where we wanted our team members to learn beyond what they're doing at the workplace here at Vite, right? And that's how it started, and we started noticing that a lot of our customers really wanted to learn about the world of economics and finance, and we decided why not give it across to the rest of the public, right? Today, before we get started, today's topic is really important because it's about history. It's something that I love because history is from where you can start learning and avoid making mistakes that already happened in the past, right? But before we get into that topic and talk more about what we have in store, let me talk about what Vite is. Vite is a financial wellness platform where if an individual comes across to Vite, we are specializing in financial planning, where we will give them a plan for the next 2 years, helping them understand why they should choose certain products in the market based on their goals, ambitions, and what is their current stage of life, right? And this plan will keep evolving every 4 months based on what are the changes that are happening to them in their financial side as well as in their personal life. And all of these products that are suggested, if you have any questions or any doubts, we don't want you to blindly believe us. You can talk to our experts and understand why it was personalized for you. All right, so whoever's looking at the video, do try out the platform, give us feedback. Let's grow together. Let's make a sustainable future where we don't have to feel that moment of regret ever. All right, so let's get back into the topic of that we have in store for us today is the Great Depression of 1929. This is a very interesting topic mainly because of how drastic it was back then, and not just about the level of impact that it had in the US economy because it's happened in the US, but also the impact that it had around the world. Now, before we jump in, every decade has some interesting imagery or saying that gets us attracted to that particular decade. Or we could call it that's the best quote for them from that decade, right? And during the Great Depression, there is this one image that was circulating across newspapers, across books, across every single street in the states around the US, right? And that was this message of, I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, have 3 children, and no work for 3 months, but I only want one job. Right? And the Great Depression was the start of a major crisis in unemployment, or I would say a major crisis in employment, which put a lot of people out of jobs, where people were struggling to make a living, right? And that's how the whole Great Depression started. And it didn't just last for a few years. If you see what I'm showing here, it started from 1929 and went on till 1941, which was a huge period of time, like a long period of time, right? And if you see the word depression that most of us really want to understand, like a lot of us would have a thought process, okay, what is depression, right? We've heard about recession, we've heard about inflation, right? Recession is nothing but these 2 components playing a major role and playing that role for a continuous period of time, where there's a continuous drop in GDP and unemployment. And that's what happened during that period of Great Depression in the US. And the impact was felt in Asia, Europe, Germany, everywhere, right? So now jumping into the topic, it started in 1929, but it went on till 1941, and it stopped just before the World War II started, right? And the interesting point here is it came after the World War I. And I'll tell you why it came after the World War I and the reason behind this entire scenario to happen. So stock market crash happened in 1929, where in October 24, there was something called as a Black Thursday, where over 12.9 million shares were sold And immediately the subsequent week, which was a Tuesday, which was then later termed as Black Tuesday, because 16 million shares additionally were sold. Right? Because of this, the entire market started crashing. And why did that happen? Because post-World War, when the US economy started coming up, people started speculating about the market and speculating about the companies that were doing so well, right? So the speculations led for the US public to buy more and more stocks. So what happened? The value of this stock rose up to unsustainable levels. So when suddenly people started selling them, the entire market started crashing. You can see this dip right here, right? This dip is because of that particular crash, all right? And further, what really led to this crash is very interesting. Like I said, between 1920 and 1929, it was called as the Roaring Twenties. And why was it roaring? Because it just was right after the World War I. And if you guys remember, or if you guys don't know, I can explain. World War I happened between 1914 to 1918, 4 years then. And post that, what happened was more soldiers, after the war was done, they came back home, which means there were more people who were ready to start contributing to the economy. So the employment started increasing. Right? So more people had the opportunity to start working for the economy. Now further, there were a lot of projects which were kept on hold because of the World War. These projects, the government started restarting them. So which again led to more employment. People needed more hands on deck to complete these projects, right? Now, apart from this, the entire economy started flourishing because people started inventing new things. The washing machine came into the market. The vacuum cleaners came into the market. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford, they themselves launched their T model cars, which were hitting the streets of the US. So people started spending so much, right? Because everything started to come back to normalcy, right? And further, what happened here is these spendings were not happening from their own earning, because the government started giving stimulus. They started pumping a lot of money into the economy, because of which the banks started giving loans to these individuals to buy and spend into the economy. So people, if they wanted to buy like a car, right, they went, got a loan. Then they wanted to buy a vacuum, they went and got a loan. And there were reckless speculations around, oh, this company will do insanely well, so that let's start putting money into that. And consumers started becoming very overconfident during this particular period, right? So this long period of rising market growth was great, but what came after that was the whole misery of the Great Depression, right? So if you look at it, the main consequence of the crash was there was a sudden decline in consumer confidence. Because suddenly when people started seeing that people were selling these stocks and the stock market started crashing because they were overvalued, the market was overvalued, right? People started spending less and investing less just into the market and everything else. And you need to remember that people had enough income coming in during that Roaring Twenties that they realized that, okay, no, I want more income. So they started putting more and more money into the market to see those returns come into their pockets. So when this particular crash started happening, people started spending less and investing less. Now, because of this, the production in these factories and manufacturing units started taking a hit, because people are not ready to buy these products that was being manufactured. Because of that, the production companies had to cut down on labor. So they had to cut down and bring like fire people and add on to that unemployment issue that was starting. And then finally, because of this unemployment, what happened was there was a decrease in purchasing power. So it became like a cyclic issue. Like I should have added another arrow here to show you that it's a cyclic issue, because again, people didn't have the money to start purchasing anything, right? Now, it was not just this that was the main cause for the Great Depression. People still are trying to figure out why it happened, but I could tell you that there were a series of events that were happening. Some were happening parallel, some were happening in a sequential order, but all of these other events were also happening, right? And why I feel this topic is super important is that these series of events helped the today's world to understand what they shouldn't do in terms of making physical and monetary policies, right? So that's very important for us to take back from this particular examples. So the other causes were the mistakes that were made by the young Federal Reserve. They were super young. They were what the primary mistake that they did was before the stock crash, they started pumping a lot of money, wherein they wanted the monetary expansion in the US to be has 28 billion between that period of 1921 to 1928, which is the roaring 20s. Like I said, when they started pumping so much money, banks had enough money to give loans, lend money to consumers. Right? Now, what happened was suddenly when the crash happened, the Federal Reserve decided to cut this entire expansion by 1/3, which created like a liquidity problem in the society. People didn't have money to go, like they were trying to liquidate their bank accounts, but there was no money in the bank to for them to keep back in. Right? And keep this in mind because I'll talk more about this later down, because this made a huge impact and over 11,000 banks went down. Right, 11,000 banks. All right. Now, the other important issue that happened during that time was a troubled agricultural sector in the 1920s. So you need to understand that during the World War, US, a lot of other countries were producing a lot of things so that it can support the army frontline. The other reason was a troubled agricultural sector in the 1920s. You need to remember that during the World War period, the World War I, 1914 to 1918, most of the countries were contributing to the fighters who were fighting in the front line. So they were increasing their food production, the uniforms that was needed, the defense sector was producing a lot. All of these things were happening. But what happened, main thing that happened was agriculture was booming. The industry was booming mainly because they wanted more food to be sent overseas or to the people who were fighting for the country. Now, for this, the government started giving loans, or they started reducing the interest rate for farmers so that they can buy equipments at a cheaper rate. So they bought these huge equipments, farming equipments that can help them produce more products. But what happened was post World War I, this expansion that they did was no longer needed. There was no war to fight, because of which the farmers didn't have the necessity to use these machines, and they didn't have the necessity to even produce more than what was needed during that period. So because of what happened is most of the products that were there in the farmland was rotting in the field itself, because there's no way to harvest them, because there was no consumer to consume them. Right? So that was a main important problem. Now, simultaneously, like we would think that, okay, maybe these two are the only reason that led to all of this happening, right? But the crazy thing is that during the same time, there was a drought in the southern plains, right? During the 1930s. And because of the drought, the arid lands created a lot of high-speed winds and dust, which started moving away from Texas to Nebraska, killing so many people, livestock, crops. A lot of that was happening. So because of this, a lot of people living in these areas who were farmers, who were contributing to the economy there, started moving out of those places and started coming into the cities. So when this happened, the city didn't have enough employment opportunities. Because of it, the employment rates again increased, right? Now, these are the main reasons. And if you see this image that you see here, people were wearing, like how we had COVID masks, they had masks which looked even more like scary that they were wearing to even walk outside, because it was just dust which was just flowing from one place to another. Right? Now, apart from all of this, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act of 1930 created even more pressure. So these are like the physical policies, right? The government's making these policies, and they were making these policies at a really, really wrong time. So before this, they used to impose agricultural taxes, right? But what they did after 1930 was they decided to impose like duties, like import duties on a lot of foreign products. Over 800 foreign products had this import duties on them. So because of this, what happened was the foreign imports that were coming in, right? And that completely fell down. So from 7 billion in 1929, it went down to 2.5 billion in 1932. Right? And that created a lot of issues. The entire international trade that was happening, they were all under a lot of stress because of these sanctions that were made, these tax sanctions. And the trade declined by 66%. And this was right in the middle of the economic crisis starting, right? 1932, like this was a time when it was about to start and all of this was happening, right? Now, finally, during the same time, another fiscal policy that they could have taken was move away from the gold standard. And if you remember, I told you to remember about that whole monetary expansion that the young Federal Bank did, right? So gold standard is nothing but back then, now we don't use it anymore. The reserves, the central banks and the reserves would tie the gold to the amount of money that they can print. But the problem is that this was not easy to do. It was not easy to print more money and mine enough gold to match it, right? And this was an international standard, right? A lot of countries did change the policies later on. I'll talk about it in the conversation. But this was something that was very important, and US should have changed it at that time, but they didn't. They refused to stick to it. Because of this, not only did they get affected, but also other countries which were also tied to the same gold standard started seeing the impact. All right. Now, all of this is happening, we will think that maybe during these times, maybe a strong leader could ideally take them out of this journey, right? Take them out of this hardship. But what happened was President Herbert Hoover was appointed into the office, and he used this interesting saying that use the powers of the government to cushion the situation being the Great Depression. Right? But what he did was he increased the federal spending by 42%. In a time like this, they should be cutting down on these spendings and concentrating more on the revival of the economy. So instead, he increased the spendings. He started putting more money into public work. Right? Over 140 million was sanctioned by him for public works. And further, he also set up something called as a Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave loan for these public works to happen smoothly, right? And this is all happening during the Great Depression, right? And to fund these new projects, he started imposing taxes, like fresh new taxes on the people. And not only this, he also thought it was the best time for him to ban immigration like in 1930 so that he can keep the low-skilled workers from flooding the labor market. Right? So because of which there were not enough people available to do like labor in the US. So all of this kind of led to an issue as well. And we don't know whether this had a major impact, but all of this did happen during that time. These are the fiscal policies that was happening simultaneously when the monetary policies were also going on. Now, what happened is the next in line after this, Herbert was not famous, like he wasn't like celebrated for these small decisions that he took. But the next person who came in was Franklin Roosevelt, and he said, he had this amazing saying that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, and that's quite amazing. And what he did was he did something smart, that he wanted to stabilize the economy, right? And for that he set up something called as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Securities Exchange Commission. Now these two things that he set up back then is still existent in the US economy, right? So one of them, which is the FDIC, was set up to make sure that depositors, the consumers who are depositing money into the banks, they have some level of insurance so they don't lose all their money, which solved for the liquidity issue that was happening. Even today in India, RBI has one such thing. Right? And in one of our videos, we did speak more about them, right? And SEC is nothing but like how India has SEBI, they set up like a trading board where the entire stock market was monitored and it was governed by SEC, right? So this made a lot of brought in a lot of stability into the US economy. But apart from this, he also gave sanction to something called as a New Deal, which is nothing but reformative and constructive modules like to help set up like a minimum wage policy, regulatory working conditions, like to make it more better for consumers to work in the economy. And even he bought like labor, like he promoted labor unions, right? So people were heard during this period of time. So these kind of reforms were made by him during this time. Now, we might think, okay, this is what is happening, and Roosevelt slowly started bringing these reforms to take things back to normal. But what was happening in the rest of the world is also equally important, right? So the gold standard did affect the opportunity for other countries to also expand their currency value. And most of them were so tied to the US because of trade and other reasons. And also because of what happened during the World War I. A lot of these European countries started borrowing money from the US to make weapons and to build armies, build a stronger army for themselves to fight the war, right? So once the war was done, US was expecting these loans to be repaid, right? But what was happening is, because of the Great Depression, these countries were also under debt. And because of that, they weren't able to repay, and US was under even more tricky, cornered situation, right? Now, talking about within the European nation, the country called Germany signed a treaty at that time post World War I, where they decided that, they decided to take loan from the US, and they decided to develop the country post that with that loan. And they never thought about imposing a tax on their own people to satisfy for these developments, right? So what happened is, when the depression was happening, this again affected Germany, and Germany couldn't repay those loans. Now, coming down to Asia. So Asia was supplying most of the raw materials to US and the European nations, especially UK, during the war and even post that. But when the depression started, the imports reduced, and because of this, people were not able to export things from these Asian countries to the US and to the European markets. So this also created a huge problem in the economy. So moving from the European and the German problems, when we jump into the Asian side of the world, they were supplying most of the raw materials to UK, Europe, and to the US during the World War period. So when these countries went into the Great Depression, what happened is the exports from these countries reduced, which pushed them also into like painful recession and depression during this period. So all over the globe, there was something or the other happening because of the Great Depression. Now, what happened, or when did we actually come out of it, is very interesting. When the US started entering the World War II, right? That's when the depression, the Great Depression started ending. Why? Because there was more spending in the defense industry. The more number of people started going into war. Over 16 million of US citizens were enlisted to fight in the war. And further, apart from that, from unemployment from 8 million became 1 million, because more and more industrial revolution was needed to support the war again, right? So all of this was happening. And when did this World War II happen? This was when the Japanese Empire bombed the Pearl Harbor. So that's when the US decided to enter into the war, and that led into the stop of the Great Depression, right? Even though it started because of the roaring 20s, it kind of ended because of another evil. So ironically, one evil put an end to another. So that's what really happened in this scenario. So what we need to really take away from this entire story, or this entire concept, is that so many such learnings have happened in our time, and each and every learning has some level of changes that has come into our economy. For instance, like we said, the setup of SEC and FIDC, FDIC, So FDIC. So these things played a major role, and it was done way back then when there was a necessity, and now it's still continued because it's become like a standard, right? And people today, post 1970s, the people moved away from gold standards. US moved away, and almost most of the countries have moved away from the gold standards, right? So it's very important for us to take these learnings. So even today, what happened during COVID is also another learning for us all to take back, right? So that is all for today, folks. So if you guys have any doubts, any questions, any feedback, please do drop it on the comment box, and we are more than happy to take your suggestion for another topic so that we can render it to you with our own efforts and research on top of it. All right, thank you so much for listening in, and have a lovely day.